Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. So today we'll be reviewing A Unit 4, and the time period is from the 1800s to 1848. So this period is all about expanding democracy, growing the economy, and increasing division, especially over slavery. And by the end, we're basically setting up everything that leads to the Civil War. So let's start off with the election of 1800s and political ideologies. So, this is where Thomas Jefferson defeats John Adams. This is huge because it's the first peaceful transfer of power between political parties. Two competing divisions were the Federalists, which were like Hamilton and Adams, which had the loose interpretation of the Constitution, a strong federal government like national banks, and they were pro-British. And the Democratic Republics, which was like Jefferson, had a strict interpretation, limited federal government, and really focused on like agrarian farming society. And they were pro-French. And Jefferson says he wants a small government, but once he's in power, he doesn't always stick with that. So let's talk about his expanding federal power. So the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. So France, led by Napoleon, offers to sell all Louisiana territory, and Jefferson buys it for $15 million, which doubles the U.S. size. But the problem is the U.S. Constitution says you can't just buy land. But Jefferson uses a loose interpretation. Also, people were concerned how they were going to be able to manage this land. But he challenged this by exploration, such as Meriwether Lewis and William Clark explored the West. They gather data, map the land, and interact with the Native Americans. Also, the Embargo Act of 1807. So Europe is in chaos because of the Napoleon Wars. So like Britain and France were against each other, and both sides were in a mess with US trade. Britain was doing imprisonment, which were kidnapping the sailors, and France was seizing the ships. So Jefferson responds with this all with the Embargo Act, cutting off all foreign trade. The result was it hurt US economy badly. People started smuggling, and it shows federal power can go very far. Now let's focus on the Supreme Court getting more powerful. So under Chief Justice John Marshall, what happened was the Marbury v. Madison in 1803, which established judicial review. So the Supreme Court can declare laws unconstitutional or not. Also, the McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819, which was saying that the federal law is greater than and more important than state law. Also established the National Bank as constitutional. Another court case was Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824, and basically what was established is that federal government controls interstate commerce. So overall, all these court cases show that the Supreme Court has become a major power player. Now let's focus on the market revolution. This is a huge transformation. Before, society was like small farms, self-sufficient, subsistence, which means after, the national economy becomes based on buying and selling goods. New technologies also, such as the cotton gin, which also increases slavery, steel plow, which leads to faster farming, mechanical repair, which means less labor is needed, and steam engine, which means faster production. So, factory systems were like mass production, division of labor, and interchangeable parts. There's also the transportation revolution, such as roads. An example is the Cucumberland Road. Also canals, an example is the Erie Canal. And of course, railroads. So everything becomes more connected now. And now regions can specialize in specific things, such as the North specializes in manufacturing, the South is focusing on cotton, and the West is focusing on food. So, now, regional differences and conflict. Different regions have different priorities. So there are tariffs. The North supports it because it protects industry, while the South hates it and it raises prices. This also leads to the Panic of 1819, which is a huge economic crash, and people blame it on the National Bank. Moving on to Missouri Compromise of 1820, which was led by Henry Clay. The outcome of it was Missouri became a slave state, but Maine became a free state to balance it out. And also the 30-60-30 line was established, which means slavery was banned above it. But this was all a temporary solution, but big future conflict. Now moving on to the American system. It was proposed by Henry Clay as well, and he proposed tariffs, national bank, and infrastructure, and the goal was to unite the economy. Moving on to the War of 1812. The causes of this, as we established earlier, the trade that was going on with US and Britain and France they were basically bullying the US. They were imprisoning their US people. The British supported the Native Americans, which were going against the US, and also just trade restrictions. So, this established people such as the war hawks, and they just wanted war, which were mostly young Americans. Anyways, the results of all this was it ends in the Treaty of Gannett. I don't know how to pronounce that. In 1814, and it was basically a stalemate, but it increases nationalism. Moving on to the era of good feelings. Under James Monroe, it was a one-party system, national pride and growth. Also established was the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, basically saying that Europe has to stay out of Americans and the US has to stay out of Europe. So, moving on to the election of 1828, Andrew Jackson wins, and he represents the common man, like the Western frontier voters. He's focusing on the common American, like the farmers basically. And what he does is he expands voting, so more property requirements are removed, and more white men can vote, like white not property owning men. So in Jackson's presidency, he proposed the nullification crisis. South Carolina basically tries to ignore the tariffs, but Jackson responds by threatening force, and the compromise is reached. Also, the bank war. Jackson destroys the national bank. He thinks it's favorable to the elites, and he moves money to state banks. Also established during his presidency was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and basically it forces Native Americans west. And there was a case, Worcester versus Georgia, and Supreme Court supports the Cherokees, but President Jackson ignores it, which leads to the Trail of Tears. Also, the market revolution did lead to some social change, as now there was the new classes such as the working class, the middle class, and the elite. Also, women started to, begin some activism. Also, immigration. Many Irish and Germans were coming, such as the Irish were coming because of the potato famine. This leads to nativism, which is an anti-immigrant movement. So now focusing on reform movements. So there was the Second Great Awakening, which is another religious revival, and it pushes reform further. So looking at abolition. So there were key figures such as Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison. So basically in the North, anti-slavery movements were growing, while in the South, they defend slavery as a positive good. Another reform was the women's rights. So there was the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, and this is where they also created the Declaration of Sentiments, which basically is a declaration of independence, but also including women, and it was led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Other reforms were established, such as the temperance, which is anti-alcohol, and education and mental health reform, which was also led by Dorothea Dix. Now looking more into slavery and resistance. So there was lots of enslaved resistance, like basically cultural resistance and rebellions like Nat Turner. Also, there were free black communities such as church and schools, and had lots of activism. So overall, Unit 4 is about growth, so economy, land and democracy, change such as new technology and new voters, and conflict, especially over slavery. And all this tension is building toward one thing: a civil war, which we'll be seeing in the next unit. And I hope you guys enjoyed. Bye!